Three speakers with very original, wide-ranging but original papers, very exciting. So I'm going to very briefly introduce them, and then we'll move directly. We'll have the three papers together, and then we'll have time for, and I really, if everyone can question, 20 minutes for loyauté, and not more, and then there'll be time for questions. But we're going to have first Dr. Otto Luthar, historian and researcher from the Center for Interdisciplinary Research at the Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts. Works on many things, including the history of historiography, cultural history, and has worked particularly on the politics of the past, the relationship between literature and historiography, materiality of the past, and is interested in museums and museum interpretations of events. He's the author of many works, including The Land Between, A History of Slovenia. And was that in English or in German?
In English.
In English. So that came out in 2013 as a collaborative work with many authors. And then he's also the author of a monograph on anti-Semitism and the destruction of the Jewish community of Prekmurje, and that came out in Ljubljana in 2012. We're our second speaker, so I have them out of order. We have Françoise Ouzan, and then we have our second speaker is Tsilla Hershco, who is a historian, political scientist, and is a research associate at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar-Ilan University, works on Israeli-French relations, Israeli-EU relations, France and the Middle East, politics of the memory of the Holocaust in France, and similar topics. And her articles have covered many topics, including France, Zionism and the creation of Israel, and an article intriguingly called "Those Who Walk in the Darkness Will See the Light: The French Jewish Resistance in France." A book, sorry, and during World War II. I saw the quotation marks, and quotation marks mean an article in English, so as opposed to a book. And then last speaker will be Françoise Ouzan, who is associate professor, or was the associate professor at the University of Aviv, prior to her current position here at Tel Aviv University in the Goldstein-Goren Diaspora Research Center. Also a researcher at the French Research Center in Jerusalem. And her books include Ces Juifs dont l'Amérique ne voulait pas, Histoire des Américains Juifs, in 2008, De la mémoire de la Shoah de la monde juif. It was co-edited with Don Michman. And a historical novel, Demain nous partons. That's, is Ronnie still here? Yeah, so we have Demain nous partons, Machar Nachnu Yotzim, or Ozvim. Is it Yotzim or Yotzvim? Ozvim, probably. Yeah, Ozvim, because it's really leaving for good. She participated in the Dictionnaire de la Shoah and in the documentary La Vie après la Shoah, and she has co-edited Holocaust Survivors, Resettlement Memories, Identities, and Post-War Jewish Displacement and Rebirth. So we have a panel devoted to issues involving partisans, rebels, and the like, and we will begin with Dr. Luthar.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be in Israel again. Well, the paper I'm going to present here describes a particular part of rather widespread Jewish resistance in Yugoslav partisan movement. Or even more precise, I will talk about one particular Jewish combat unit that was established by the concentration camp internees on the Croatian island Rab. In reconstructing the circumstances in which the Jewish battalion as part of the Partisan Iraq Brigade was established, I will particularly focus on a group of Jewish nurses who, after the brigade reached the mainland, joined different partisan formation in Slovenia. There are actually two reasons for my decision to do so. Firstly, this was a group of women, and women, particularly those who were not communists and so-called heroes of the national liberation struggle, have to date remained a hidden part of the history of partisan resistance. The second reason is the ratio between Jewish men and women joining the Yugoslav resistance movement, which was almost 35% In the Jewish Battalion, for example, the ratio was even higher, at one point even 50%. In general, however, the ratio was 8 times more than the ratio of other women in other partisan units, which was between 4 and 5%. Although I'm interested in this particular group, this is not a typical microhistory study, but a series of microhistorical discoveries that seeks to shed light on a macro-historical process. Nevertheless, like most, if not all micro worlds, the micro-history of a particular person, group, or of people belongs to a specific macro-historical setting or commonplace. In our case, the macro-historical setting being the Nazi and fascist occupation of Yugoslavia. Leaving aside the introductory sketch of the April War of 1941 and the topography of the occupation, which usually open a vast majority of histories of the Second World War in Western Balkans, I shall focus only on the territory of Ustaša-led independent state of Croatia, or Nezavisna Država Hrvatska, as this pro-Nazi and pro-fascist creation was formally named. And this state included part of present-day Croatia, excluding Istria, Dalmatia, and the majority of Adriatic islands, as well as almost entire Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Italians, on the other hand, occupied most of the Adriatic coast and the western part of present-day Slovenia. Barring a few exceptions, the occupation regimes, at least in Croatia, were incomparable. The collaborationist government in Zagreb immediately passed the anti-Semitic laws and set up 2 concentration camps before the summer of 41. By the end of the war, the system of concentration camp with Jasenovac, known as the most infamous, had grown into a network of 26 camps, of which 5 were extermination camps. According to the survivors' accounts and interviews I did with some survivors, the first to flee from Ustaša state were well-off Jewish families, or the families who had part of their possessions or relatives in the Italian zone. Similar developments took place in Slovenia. The regimes in the Italian and Hungarian occupation zones could not be compared to the situation in the northeastern part of present-day Slovenia, which was under German occupation, not least also because it was considered part of the so-called Old Reich. Most Jews from Lower Styria therefore escaped either to Prekmurje, which was occupied by Hungarians, or to Provincia di Ljubljana, established by the Italians. The situation changed in the spring of 42, when the Italians altered their policy in response to the increased partisan activity. This was also the time when the most remaining Jewish family that lived in Slovenia or came to Ljubljana from the other parts of Central Europe after 1939 escaped to Italy. For the Slovenes, on the other hand, there was no way out, particularly for those who lived on the so-called partisan liberated territory in the south. After Italian offensive against the Partisans, which lasted most of the spring and part of the summer of 42, most people from that area who could not join the Partisans or could not flee to other parts of the region ended up in the concentration camp on the island of Rab in northern Adriatic. The camp was established especially for them, and it was the worst of all concentration camps in Italy. Owing to the swampy terrain and unhygienic conditions, which caused mass diseases as well as the lack of food and drinking water, forced labor, and the maltreatment of the internees by the fascists, it was comparable to Nazi concentration camps. Originally, there were two parts of the camp, which later developed into a system of 5 sections. Section 1 for men, Section 2 for Jews, Section 3 for women and children, Section 4 was a prison, and 5 a cemetery. Section 2 was built in early 43. According to the calculations of Italian military authorities, the total capacity of RAP concentration camp was 20,000 and was to be increased to 30,000. However, this plan never materialized because of Italy's capitulation in early September 43. The first transport of civilian deportees from Slovenia reached the island in July 42 in a course of the general population transfer from the already mentioned territory. By the end of August, there were already 6,000 internees on the island, and by the end of November, the number climbed up to 9,000, including Croats from the annexed province of Rijeka or Fiume. The total number of internees who passed through the RAP concentration camp between July 42 and September 43 was over 40,000 men, women, and children. Almost 4,000 of them died. The first victim was a 3-month-old child who died in August. With the approach of fall and winter, the daily number of deaths rapidly increased. By the end of 42, several hundreds of women and children had been transformed to the other concentration camps in Italy that were where the conditions were slightly better. And on this map you can see all the camps and places of detentions where the Slovenes were kept between the end of 41 and September 43, and you can see RAP is here. Beside hundreds of younger men who were sent back to provincial Ljubljana to serve in the pro-Italian military organization Militia Volontaria Anticomunista, the majority stayed until the arrival of several Jewish transports in May and June of 43. The majority of newcomers were transferred from a number of camps along the Dalmatian coast, and some were shipped from smaller towns in the neighboring area. The total number was 3,577 men, women, and children, some of whom were already organized in the Anti-Fascist Liberation Front. This was of particular importance for the later developments. Although the Jews were settled in separate sections, Section 2 and 3, they were from the very beginning able to collaborate with the already existing Liberation Front organization in the camp. This was also one of the reasons that the brigade could be established immediately after the internees took over the camp. The other reason was the formation of the underground self-defense organization composed of a network of troikas, groups of 3 people, that formed well-organized security units of 40 men and women. These units were later transferred into regular platoons and battalions of approximately 240 up to 280 men and women. The members of the military security units secretly controlled all important points in the camp, as well as the surrounding areas where internees were forced to work. After the disarmament of the guards, which happened one day after the capitulation on September 10th, and later the entire Italian company, which was composed by around 2,200 men on the island, the volunteers were invited to enroll in the RAP Brigade. The same day, a message was sent to the headquarters of the Partisan army on the mainland requesting that the brigade be incorporated into Partisan units as soon as possible. The brigade was organized in 5 battalions, and at the time of formation consisted of 1,760 volunteers, and the 5th battalion which you can see here on that slide, composed of more than 280 Jews, men and women, led by David Kabilio and Ewald Ehrlich. And Ehrlich was so-called reserve officer. Now I'm referring to your lecture. You've said that we should be careful what was part of the resistance and people who were actually soldiers. So Ewald was a soldier and Kabilio was a resistant fighter. According to my main informant, Anton Vratusha is the name of the man, who was the deputy commander of the whole brigade. The creation of the Slovenian Jewish Croatian unit was, quote, the result of resolute collective action taken by the Partisans and under extremely difficult conditions.
Which flag they are carrying?
Yugoslav.
Yugoslav.
The new Yugoslav. I mean, non-existing Yugoslav flag, because this was a partisan, and later on in '45 became a former Yugoslav flag in November '33 after this meeting in Jajce in Bosnia, where the 43, yeah. In addition to 244 members of Jewish Battalion, there were at least 35 to 40 nurses who joined the 3 Slovenian battalions. 5 of these women also took part in the brigade's first operation on the neighboring islands of Cres and Lošinj. After they disarmed 2 Italian posts and took control over the strategic channel between islands Cres and Lošinj, the fighters returned to Rab. Upon disembarkation of the brigade on the Dalmatian coast, the Jewish battalion was ordered to join the units of the Yugoslav Liberation Army in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, as already stressed, between 33 and 35 Jewish nurses were given orders to proceed with Slovenian battalions to Slovenia, where most of them continued to serve in the different partisan units. At least 2 of them lost their life in the battlefield. On September 21st, the Rab Brigade was incorporated into the system of Slovenska Narodna Osvobodilna Vojska, People's Liberation Army of Slovenia, as the 16. Udarna Brigada, or 16th Mobile Brigade, and sent to the battlefield. However, after a massive offensive of the German and armed forces which took over the territory previously occupied by the Italians, the Slovenian part of the Rab Brigade was reorganized. The Jewish battalion, as already mentioned, underwent the same process. There are many interpretations as to why it was reorganized or dissolved. Alexander Lebel, one of the few living members whom I also interviewed, who lives in Belgrade, believes that the headquarters of the partisan army were not in favor of a national unit or military national unit. According to David Kabilio, the commander of the battalion, however, the decision to reorganize the unit was proposed by him and Ewald Ehrlich. So the command of the Croatian partisan forces only agreed and decided that the battalion be incorporated into 7. Banijska Divizija, 7th Banija Division. According to Jaša Romano, the greatest expert on Jewish involvement in Yugoslav resistance, 51 of them, of this almost 300 of original members of the Jewish battalion, died. The total number of Jewish internees from the Rab concentration camp who joined the Partisan, however, was 1,339. 690 serving in combat units and around 650 in the rear of the army. The later were either part of medical staff, drivers, army officials, members of propaganda units, and so forth. Exactly half of this second group were women. 136 died in a battle or were killed in other occasions, including Ewald Ehrlich, who, after being wounded, captured, tortured, and even scalped, was killed by the Ustascha. Well, what happened to the rest of the internees? A vast majority was taken to the mainland and took refuge on the so-called liberated territory. Around 200 were taken to the island of Vis and then to Bari, Italy. Of around the same number, that is 200, of those who stayed on the island, only 2 women survived the deportation to the German concentration camp Auschwitz. Now I come to the Jewish nurses. According to Bratusha, Jascha Romano, Alexander Leber, and the testimonies of some of survivors, the complete list of nurses of the Rat concentration camp included nearly 70 women, and at least half of them were ordered to join the Slovenian battalions. A truck accident prevented 7 of them from joining the first meeting point of the brigade on the Slovenian territory. However, it may be claimed with certainty that 29 of 30 joined the majority before the brigade was reorganized. Now, the structure of this group, 2/3 of these women were from the 4 biggest cities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, meaning Sarajevo, Mostar, Tuzla, Banja Luka, while the others came from smaller places. Given that as many as 107 members of the battalion came from Sarajevo, the high percentage of the nurses from the Bosnian capital does not come as a surprise, just as the fact that slightly higher number of them were from Sephardic families and that a vast majority of them communicated with each other in Ladino. Most of them were trained as nurses in infirmary that was part of the Jewish section of concentration camp. Their mentors were 33 Jewish physicians and pharmacists who worked in that infirmary or in 2 hospitals in the town of Rab. Only 1 had medical training from before the war. Until now, I could gather the exact information of most of them, which would not be possible without Anton Bratusha's list of all partisan units in which they served. The whereabouts of some of them still remains unknown. Similarly, nothing is known about the circumstances in which 2 of 3 nurses died while attending the wounded. On the other hand, we know exactly what happened to Thea Lederer. This is Thea. Who joined the Ljubljanska Brigada or Ljubljana Brigade. In June 1944, the Germans and the collaborating Domobranci penetrated the liberated territory and cut off the connections between the main body of the brigade and the wounded, disregarding the explicit order to remain in the rear. To recovered from her recent injury, Thea returned, treated the wounded, and enabled their withdrawal. She herself was captured and killed on the spot by the Domobranci. After the war, only few of these women stayed in Slovenia. According to my discoveries, majority of them went back to Bosnia or Croatia. 6 emigrated either to Israel, Spain, United Kingdom, Canada. Only 4 actually stayed in Slovenia. The majority of them were university or high school students, followed by housewives, officials, and 1 worked as a hairdresser before the deportation. Well, I'm going to skip because I don't have much time left, and end with the overall information about the Jewish fighters in the Yugoslav resistance. So it were 4,572 that joined, and around 3,000 served in the partisan units, and something more than 1,500 in other roles. Considering the number of casualties, the later perhaps proved more dangerous, as nearly 600 of them died or were killed upon capture. In the partisan units, this ratio was slightly more in favor of survivors. Of even greater importance, however, is the fact that over 1/3 of them were women. Exact numbers for now is 1,569. 1/3 of the whole group, men, women, came from Croatia. Almost the same number were from Bosnia and Herzegovina. More than 1/4 from Serbia, and the rest from Macedonia, Montenegro, Slovenia, and other regions. And more than 1,318 to be exact of them died. Thank you very much.
You're missing a chair? Or do you have a chair? Okay. All right. Please.
During the Second World War, about 35,000 Jewish combatants fought against the Vichy regime and the Nazis in the framework of the French army. The French resistance and the Jewish-French resistance. The interior French forces. The data regarding the number of the
Yeah, it's a bit awkward, yeah.
I think, no,
Yeah. There you go.
excuse me, adjust it. The data regarding the number of Jewish combatants in France are incomplete. Inter alia, due to the clandestine war and due to the French Republican concept of separation between state and religion, which laïcité it is called, which forbids the formal registration of one's religion. It has been estimated that the number of Jewish combatants was far above their percentage in the French population, and that they constituted approximately 0.75% of the population and 5% of the combatants. In the present paper, I'll focus on the Jewish resistance groups which united under the umbrella organization of the OGC, Organisation Juive de Combat, a combating organization. This paper, which is based on wartime documents and post-war testimonies and publication, presents briefly the motivations of Jewish combatants in joining the OGC, their dilemma, their interaction with the French resistance, and their participation in the liberation combats, as well as in the final combats to defeat Germany. Here it's against what you say now, that really they not only participated in the war military war against the Nazis and Vichy, but also in the war to combat to defeat the Nazi Germany. Finally, the paper underlines the gap between the contribution of the OGC Jewish combatants on one hand and their impact on the historical memory of World War II in France and in Israel, and on the other hand. I start with a brief background of the Holocaust in France. France was conquered by Nazi company Germany in June 1940 and was divided in two parts. The northern region, which was under direct German rule, and the southern one, where so-called Free French regime, was headed by Marshal Pétain, with Vichy as its capital. The persecutions of the Jews, in which the Vichy regime played a dominant role, started shortly afterwards. The Aryanization measures, the creation of detention camps, and finally the massive deportation of Jews to the concentration camps in Eastern Europe. Almost 76,000 Jews perished out of a community of about 330,000 Jews in France. including about 30,000 refugees who came at the eve of the war. The OGC was as I said, was an umbrella organization which comprised about 9 autonomous Jewish groups that were formed especially to help the Jews in France. The most prominent ones were the Jewish Scouts and their clandestine branch named the Sixième, the Jewish Army, AJ, Armée Juive, the Organization of Assistance for Children, or Ouzan, and the clandestine branch named the Groupe Garel, and the movement of the Zionist youth, MGS. There were also smaller networks such as that of Moussa Abadi, the Group André, and the Dash Group. It should be noted that behind the names of the organization, there are tremendously moving personal stories which I cannot tell in this form because of the time limit. The uniqueness of the OGC was its organized clandestine work, which was intended to rescue Jews. They also set the goal to fight jointly with the French resistance against the Nazis and their French collaborators for the liberation of the French territory. This brings us to the distinction between the Jewish resistance in France and the resistance of Jews in France within the ranges of the general French resistance or afterwards the French army. Indeed, both set up the goal of liberating the French territory. However, the issue of providing an urgent response to the persecutions of the French Jews was not on the agenda of the general French resistance. During the war, the members of the various OGC groups cooperated in a wide range of activities. They rescued thousands of adults and children by providing them with hiding places or forged papers. They organized convoys to Switzerland and Spain. They formed combat units or guerrilla groups in the main cities of France and in the mountains, the Maquis, known as the Maquis. They maintained a network of secret agents who transferred money from Switzerland to France for the various underground activities and needs. Finally, following the Allied invasion in June 1944, they participated in the framework of the general French resistance and the Allies in the fighting to liberate France and until the German defeat. Due to the OGC clandestine activity, it is impossible to fix the exact number of the OGC members. In the Polonsky archives, one of the senior commanders of the OAG, who conferred his archives to me, there is a list of about 2,000 names of OGC members, OGC they say it in French. However, there were also people who performed a mission not on a permanent basis, sometimes without knowing that they worked for the OGC. For the same reason, it is not possible to fix the exact number of French Jews who were rescued by the members of the OGC. We can, however, estimate that thousands of French Jews were rescued directly or indirectly thanks to the organized, constant, and varied activity of the Jewish resistance. This can be concluded from reports and oral testimonies related to the massive manufacturing and distributions of forged papers. It should be stressed that the clandestine rescue was very dangerous, like every military activity. Actually, the members of the resistance could have lived in a relative security with their forged papers and conduct their life, everyday life, like each French. However, they constantly risked their lives while accomplishing their rescue missions, passing through the numerous checkpoints of the Nazi and the Vichy regime with big amounts of money, forged papers, or food coupons. They risked their lives while searching through the French villages and cities the assistance of local clergymen, mayors, and other local employees. They did not know in advance whether these people would denounce them or help them. Many of them were captured, tortured, and sent to death camps. They did not reveal the names of their commanders and comrades or the names and hiding places of the people they hid. This was evident from the fact that their capture did not entail the capture of other people. There are the heartbreaking stories of Mila Racine and Marianne Cohn, two young assistant women who were captured by the Nazis while transferring a group of children across the Swiss border. They were tortured, but they didn't reveal the names of their colleagues and commanders. They rejected their comrades. Moreover, they rejected their comrades' proposal to rescue them, fearing that the Nazis take revenge of the children that were captured with them. I would, as already mentioned, apart from the rescuer, the OGC also carried out armed activities. It was particularly the RG which was in charge of the military training and activity. Already at the creation of its first nucleus in June 40, the RG inscribed on its platform the military struggle as well as the rescue of Jews. In addition, the group's members vowed to fight for the establishment of a Jewish state after the defeat of Nazis. To think on June 40, to think about the defeat of the Nazis, it was really incredible. The RG established also secret combat groups, they call it Copfran, in various French cities such as Toulouse, Lyon, Marseille, Grenoble, Paris, Nice. They participated in the liberation of French cities alongside the French resistance groups and the guerrilla groups known as the Maquis groups outside the city. Some of the Parisian Jewish combat groups participated in the victory parade of the Gaulle Army on August 44. One of the most moving moments occurred when members of the Jewish resistance, I'll not say the names now, were the first to enter the terrible, infamous Drancy camp and liberated the Jewish detainees designated to be sent to Auschwitz. The Jewish combat group included also a Dutch group which succeeded to forge Gestapo ID, and with this document, several young women of the group succeeded to infiltrate into the center of the Gestapo in Paris. Through these secretaries, they obtained blank documents and seals, and some young people of this group also worked in the VI and V2 missile factories and obtained plans of their installations, which made it possible later for the French resistance to blow them up. Here is the place to say some words about women in the resistance, in the Jewish resistance. Women comprise about 50% of the OGC members. They looked like any other French woman. They were very elegant. they arouse less suspicion, you know, with their laugh, and it was difficult to uncover their Jewish identity because they were not circumcised. Consequently, they accomplished many risky roles, such as transfer of weapons, money, rescue of children, armed women, accompanied men in missions in case of mishap. They were social workers. They also participated in the liberation combats of the Maki groups of the Agi, the Scouts in the Blanc Mountains, in the south of France, in the Tarn, the Haute-Loire, joined the FFE, the Interior French Forces. They participated in the combats until the final capitulation of Germany. There are a lot of stories which are not now to be told now. The relations of the OGC with the FFE, the French Interior Resistance, were ambiguous. In certain fields, such as forged papers, there was a tight cooperation between the OGC and the FFI, since the OGC members became experts in this field and they supplied forged papers to the French resistance. However, the Jewish resistance kept their autonomous activity and they didn't really always rely on the French resistance because there were many betrayals. One of the most famous betrayals was that of Jean Moulin, the emissary of de Gaulle, was captured in June 43, and up to now there is a mystery who was the one who betrayed Jean Moulin. So they were very suspicious. They didn't want to cooperate in all the things. They were organized in little groups of 7 people, including the commander. And there was the thought behind it was that if they are captured and tortured, they will not be able to reveal or to expose their other friends and commanders. So there is towards the end of the war, following the Allies' invasion, there were some cases where the members of the OGC, who were also members of the French Maki groups, received contradictory orders from their commanders in the OGC and the FFE. So on one hand, that was the case with an officer, Raoul Leons, he was a Belge, who was the commander in the French Maki, in the French General Maki, and at the same time he was a member of the AG. He received an order to present himself in Toulouse, where there were combats for the liberation, and on the other hand, his commanders in the Maki ordered him to stay. And guess what? What did he choose? He chose to obey his AG commanders. So, however, some of the OGC members had doubt whether they should join the Jewish resistance, the French resistance, or the Allies. These dilemmas are reflected, for instance, in documents where the commanders of the OGC adopt an apologetic tone when they explain the reasons for joining the Jewish separate resistance. But this is from because what I explained previously, that in France you do not accept ethno division or religious division, and it was very difficult to explain afterwards why we joined a Jewish separate resistance. Now, as to it brings us also to the memory. 10 minutes, okay.
Two.
2
minutes.
2. Okay. So I'll skip some of that. So as a memory. So there is very little known about the Jewish resistance in France and also in Israel. In fact, the Jewish authorities at first preferred to ignore the Holocaust because in the Vichy regime didn't exist. All the French were resistant, as you know. But that was for the reason of unity. But only in 1995, Chirac acknowledged French responsibility to the Holocaust of the Jews, but there was also a but. He said that French honor was saved by the French Gentiles who saved 3/4 of French Jewry. It means that the Jewish resistance have done nothing during the war. Null. There are explanations why the memory was not really, why they didn't commemorate, why the memory was not deep-rooted there in France. And one of them, because people were tired of the war, the French resistance were tired of the war, and they just wanted to continue their lives and integrate again in France. Other people, hundreds of resistance, the veterans, they were disappointed with the Vichy regime, and what they thought was their country betrayed them, and they came to Israel, and here they were busy with contributing to the new country and integrating themselves in the new country, and they didn't really tell their stories. So the story of the Jewish resistance is not very well known. I asked here how many people know, okay, between Israel. Now, the gap between Israel, I finished the last paragraph. The gap between Israel and memory exists also in Israel. Indeed, this might be attributed to the conduct of the veterans of the OGC, as I explained before. And the gap also can be explained from the fact that for many years the Israeli discourse, I use the word discourse, afterwards you are going to tell me perhaps why it's negative to say discourse. So the discourse on Second World War underlined the painful, tragic events of the Holocaust and almost ignored the participation of Jews in the military struggle. In addition, the Israeli discourse underlined the rescue of Jews by the righteous among the nations, but ignored the phenomena of Jews who rescued Jews. These two gaps in the Israeli discourse related to the Second World War are being addressed by the important project of the Museum of the Jewish Soldier and during the Second World War. And I wish also to mention the public struggle of a committee for the commemoration of Jews who rescued Jews. And finally, I express my appreciation to those behind the organization of the conference, and end with the French expression chapeau.
Maybe I'll start by saying that so that you won't hate me, because I really don't want to have you miss a few minutes from the break. I will skip a number of things, all that is analytical that you did, Tsilla, very well, and also my whole paragraph on the role of women. Of course, the role of women, which is very much unknown, is central because, as you pointed out rightly, it was difficult to recognize them, and through their charm and elegance, they could really pass much better. Okay, so I'll start. I must say that I first explored the issue of Jewish resistance fighters through the prism of their resettlement in America, in France, and in Israel. It was then that their crucial role in saving part of French Jewry appeared in most of the testimonies I collected. My interviews strikingly confirm the understated role of the Jewish resistance in France, and they throw light actually on Tsilla Hershco's findings on the gap between history and memory, memory being dependent on changing political and social considerations. Now, for some historians, the debate is still open. Can we speak of a Jewish resistance or of a participation of the Jews to the resistance movement? And we'll see perhaps this tomorrow with the Jews in North Africa. To what extent were Jewish resistance fighters clear-headed about and positives about the future of the Jews? That is a question that is not often raised. In this perspective, what were the initiatives and the responsibility of youth movements in France? These issues I will approach through the case studies of two foreign Jews who belonged to the French Jewish resistance and both immigrated to the Jewish homeland of Palestine. In other words, as Tsilla mentioned before, instead of really saying, well, we're exhausted by our fight in France, let's settle or remain in France, they continued their fight, and that was very hard because they continued a multifaceted fight in Israel, both physically as soldiers and, what is as important, fighting for Jewish identity and really strengthening Jewish identity, especially among the immigrants. So I'm going to skip a number of things. I will concentrate on two persons who were active in the Aliyat Anoa, in the youth Aliyah, and took part in the War of Independence and helped create the State of Israel. So the first one is Otto Givniewski, a young Zionist Austrian Jew. Otto is here on the left, and on the right it is Rabbi Leon Friedman, who actually, Rabbi Leon Rotman, who actually was a resistance fighter whose role was really immense. He actually escaped from an internment camp in France, but not only that, he rescued a number of people, and especially his brother, who had been also arrested. He did things that are unbelievable. And as I pointed out, he was also a rabbi. So again, the two things are connected. And in this lecture, which sounds more narrative than analytical, what I want to point out is that this is a concept. They fought in France, they continue their fight. And all that because of their motivations that came from their strong Jewish identity. So Otto Gniewski was an Austrian Jew, as I said before, who had studied chemical engineering in France because he actually came first to Belgium and then went to France, where he studied at university. He was one of the founders of the movement of Zionist Youth, MJS, for which the basic concept was unity. Unity achieved by avoiding all ideological discussions in order to better concentrate on the rescue of Jews. The other one is Oskar Bobby Levinson, also Eliezer, who was an assimilated German Jew, who also became a resistance fighter, but as a young adolescent. So their roads intersected in two geographical places in the southeast of France, where the Maquis of Grenoble was located. Grenoble, which is in the southeast, a very important town, where actually I grew up. Both of their testimonies put the stress on three elements, which I shall dwell upon. First, the specific goals and actions of the Jewish resistance in comparison with the French resistance, in which, as you recall, many Jews took part. Second, the Zionist feelings that fostered a sense of unity among the Zionist-oriented groups within the larger Organisation Juive de Combat, OJC. And last but not least, the indispensable cooperation of women in their clandestine activities, a part that I won't dwell upon because it has been well done already. So Otto Geniewski was born in Vienna in 1920 in a family of 5 children. In 1935, his parents perceived early enough the Nazi threat, and his father, who had traded with Belgium, decided the family would find refuge in the country. Geniewski was an ambitious school pupil who succeeded well in the gymnasium in Austria. Being a refugee entailed numerous difficulties, among them learning French from scratch, a challenge he accepted. Within 3 months, thanks to his good knowledge of Latin, he adapted to his new environment. In 1937, he was elected president of the Zionist Youth of Brussels. 2 years later, as Germany invaded Poland in early September 1939, Otto, who sat long hours at the university library, noticed a strange announcement in the French and Belgian newspapers. Churchill himself, the chief of British Navy, welcomed any proposal to improve army equipment. So that was a challenge for Otto Geniewski, and soon he found a device to stabilize boats in order to enable them to fire more efficiently. He sent his proposal to the officers of the British Navy. But on May the 10th, 1940, Germany attacked Belgium, the Netherlands and France. On the very day of the attack, the Belgian government summoned the German and Austrian refugees, like Otto, to come to the police station for, I quote, check of their status. Otto and his father were ready to do so when they checked the letters received in their letterbox. And guess what? What did they find in the letterbox? Dina, I'm sure you'll find out. Churchill. It was a positive, yes?
A letter?
Yes, a letter for sure from the British Navy, which meant that his invention had been accepted. And this saved his life. In fact, he was interned in France in 10,000 Jews to the camp of Saint-Cyprien, south of Toulouse. We still have the map. And he actually showed his letter to the commander of the camp, who let him out. So Otto left Brussels for Montpellier in the south of France and registered at the university in the Department of Physics and Chemistry. There, he endeavored to prepare a doctoral thesis of chemistry under the guidance of a director of research who understood his peculiar situation as a Jewish refugee of Austrian origin and who would actually help him later on. In Montpellier, he made contacts with Jewish circles, in particular the Jewish Scouts, the Éclaireurs Israélites de France, and decided to create from scratch a group of young Zionists, which he named the Gdoud of Montpellier, helped by the young influential rabbi, the Rabbi Shili, who lectured young Jews of Montpellier and recruited Gniewski in the underground. So both, even the rabbis were resistant, as was Shili. The aim of the Zionist group he headed was to eventually become pioneers in the Jewish homeland. In Montpellier, Gniewski encountered a group, and that is interesting, I think, of Spanish refugees who had settled in the French town after the victory of General Franco in the Civil War in Spain. They taught him how to use weapons, and later on, Otto Gniewski was summoned by the FTP, Front Tireur Partisan, or Partisan Irregular Riflemen, which was the group of the French resistance, to give them a training course on explosives and how to use them. So again, you'll see an interaction. They used the Jews when they needed them. For that mission, he traveled to Toulouse. On June 22nd, 1940, anti-Jewish laws were promulgated and foreign Jews were imprisoned in French internment camps. On May the 10th, 1942, Gniewski met Simon Levit, one of the heads of the Jewish Scouts, and Joseph Fischer, the president of the KKL, in order to set up a meeting between different leaders of youth movements such as Hashomer Hatzair, Poalet Zion, Anwar Hatzioni, Betar, and religious groups such as Yeshurun, who was also very active. After hours of debate, they agreed on that concept of unity. So the brutal and massive roundups, as you know, in August 1942, triggered off the initiatives of the Zionist youth movement, while for a non-Jewish Frenchman, resistance fighting was a matter of choice, political and patriotic. For a Jew, going underground was a way to stay alive. As Gniewski expressed it in our interviews, Jewish resistance, whether in the Jewish army or other youth movements, was, I quote, a specific response to the specific targeting of the Jews for extermination. The Jewish refugees who did not speak French fluently would be directed towards the French Maquis, where they would fight a guerrilla fight. So that was, as you know, a mountainous region that offered opportunities for refuge and cooperation of the local population. Now, those who mastered the French language, as Otto did, would be mobilized for forging identity cards and documents, and they would also be mobilized for forging identity, for forging authentic papers. And here I can tell you that Paul Gniewski, his brother, became an expert in the forgery of paper. He actually found out, and that was really an activity that is not physical, but essential in that it saved thousands of lives. He looked for authentic paper. He looked at, you mentioned it also, he looked for the authentic stamps, and for that, Otto Gniewski had to create contacts, especially in the region of Isère, where Grenoble is, and especially in Saint-Martin-d'Uriage with the prefecture. And fortunately, they met with a certain acceptance there. The population, and especially the prefects, were cooperative, which really, really helped. The clandestine activities of rescue were called physical training, in French, éducation physique, because its members were constantly on the move. Now, Giniewski, in our interviews, commented on the link between the specific case of rescuing Jews and the methods used. I quote, "The objective of our rescue work dictated our methods. In order to save the Jews from deportation, we had to render them invisible as Jews. We had to find them hideouts in villages in the mountains. We had to have them pass as genuine French Aryans, according to the Nazi terminology. Or still, as you mentioned, have them cross the Swiss and Spanish borders. So I won't dwell on that. Together, they rescued with all the Jewish organizations together. They rescued thousands of young Jews whose parents had been imprisoned in the Nazi death camps in World War II, and also, as you mentioned, from the internment camps in France, they helped them escape. Thanks to Giniewski's efforts, Grenoble, that town which has become famous for its maquis in the Alps mountains, became one of the most important centers of the Zionist combat organizations. Now let's recall that Grenoble, as you can see on the map, as you could have seen on the map, okay, you remember the map, southeast of France. It was, what was interesting about Grenoble is that movements were much less restricted than in the German zone, because it was occupied by the Italians, who really helped. Every time they could, they helped. Even when they left, they took in their lorries, they took Jews with them. So there, Otto Giniewski even found time for romance. One of the women who was under his order, her name was Lili Sittner, eventually became his wife, and he did not wait too long. He got married in March 1943 at the age of 23, and actually it did help him in all his missions. Why? Because, as you mentioned before, women were not suspected as much, and being in love, being a couple and everything, or in trains, really helped. But in December 1943, the Gestapo searched for Giniewski at the Electrochemical Institute in Grenoble, where he had established his headquarters. That is, with all the forgery, all the false documents. He was warned by the director of his research, Professor Jean Dubois, and left with a box of compromising documents. It must be emphasized again that these documents he provided to all the sections, all the Dudim of France. Now, I won't dwell on the interaction with the French resistance, because it has been done. But I will quote Eitan Ginat Giniewski. Eitan Ginat is the name he took when he immigrated to Israel. But their combats completed each other. Whether they had fought or died as Jewish Frenchmen, I mean Jews in the resistance, in the French resistance, I'm talking about them. Their combats completed each other. whether they had fought or died as Jewish Frenchmen or as Jews of France under the blue, white, red flag or under the blue and white flag stamped with the Star of David, whether they had sung the Marseillaise or the Hatikva, all these brothers in arms deserve the same respect. A respect he also extended to women. And there are many names, Marianne Cohn, who died, and Mila Racine, and also others who are still alive, Margot Cohn, who doesn't actually find she's a resistance fighter, and yet she saved many people because she traveled through the whole France with her bicycle, giving food coupons and so on. Also, military chaplain René Capel, who had a very important role in the underground, wrote about Gniewski. He wrote one of the most beautiful pages of the resistance under the German occupation. I'm now Bobby Levinson. I'm now talking about Bobby Levinson, who was 7 years younger and who also admired very well his chief, who was Otto Gniewski. They met in a chalet, which is a house in the Alps, in the mountains, where they found the times at the weekends to relax and to relax, to do sport, to practice sports, and also to attend lectures on Jewish identity, lectures delivered by rabbis. So Oscar Levinson joined the Zionist youth movement. Okay, I have very little time to speak about him. So in a few words, Oscar Levinson came from Germany. He came as a refugee with his mother. His mother eventually found work in the Committee for Aid to Refugees, the CAR, which was financed by the American Joint Distribution Committee. But she started as a resistance fighter, but she was taken by the Gestapo and finished with her young baby. Well, not her baby, he was I think 11 years old, but Eliezer's brother in Auschwitz. Eliezer was interned in an internment camp in the Ardèche region of France. I don't know how to come back to his pictures, actually, to his picture, but never mind. I'm going to give you an example, because we don't have much more time left, about one of his missions with Abbe Glasberg. I quote, "I rode a bicycle, which was a very precious treasure at the time, in order to save Jewish children from the internment camp of Vénissieux, near Lyon. I had to meet the priest Glasberg, who would help find a hiding place from them. I took part in several networks, in particular that of Grenoble. My main network was based in Caussade, a small town at 800 kilometers from Grenoble, where 2 German divisions were located. There was at the same place the Jewish Maquis, known for the heroic feats of its members. But what is very interesting about Levinson is that he was wearing the uniform of a French companion, which was also very dangerous because he could have been killed by the resistance as a collaborator, so to say, of Pétain, or someone who belonged to Pétain's youth. So, also, to make it short, I will emphasize another thing. He helped the Jewish resistance on June the 6th, 1944, when he was given a mission which consisted in spying the German soldiers in the southwest of France, the divisions SS Das Reich and Der Führer, while again passing as a French companion. To conclude, I would say that their fights was multifaceted. Levinson, for instance, helped with 31 French resistance fighters who made Aliyah, built Neve-Ilan. They built Neve-Ilan and helped in the battles on the road. So, and Etan Giniewski found the first manna for the army, the food rations, because he was a physicist. And he worked in Chemed, the scientific section of Tzahal. He also built up a pilot factory that was meant to extract vitamins from fruit, but that pilot factory was destroyed during the Independence War. But that's not the least of his contribution, and I must say that these two life stories, very much in a nutshell, encapsulate the fate of a generation that was both a witness of the Holocaust and of the creation of the State of Israel. And I'm very admirative for these people. Thank you.
All right, we have 6 minutes for questions and comments. Make sure people, I want to make sure guests far in the far back have a chance to ask a question, because we're the participants and we can always talk to each other. Somebody in the back there had a question, I thought? No? No hands? Yes?
I haven't been here from the beginning, but I would like to know what about the communist Jews? Where did they fight? Did they fight also in the Jewish section of the resistance, or
You want to answer?
I could answer, but she could too.
The communist, yes. A very special characteristic of this organisation juive de combat was the Zionism. Not all the people were Zionists, but this was inscribed in the main platforms of the organization. So the communists, we can say that the communists didn't adhere to the Jewish autonomous groups, because they were under, like they were with the other communists, the French communist resistance, and they were under the orders of Russia. So it was also a delicate question for the French, because they had a lot of, Jean Moulin, whom I mentioned, he came to France in order to reconcile between the communists and the other factions. But it was impossible to reconcile with the autonomous Jewish resistance, especially when they also were very suspicious towards the other groups. So during the war, they preferred to keep on their activity without interference or without telling their secrets to other groups, And then I think that afterwards, with the liberation, I think that the communists, they integrated into somehow into the general French, like the Jews, like the autonomous Jewish groups.
Maybe we can
Couple of-
mention
Sorry?
the Moi.
Yeah.
The Moi.
That's one
Maybe
thing.
we can mention the
Yes.
Moi, main-d'œuvre immigrée. A lot of them fought with the Armenians, with all the foreigners. Main-d'œuvre immigrée meant immigrated workers, and their ranks were absolutely decimated. But they were very active, but their communist identity really overshadowed their Jewish identity.
Can I add something? I would like to add that nowadays in the Memorial de la Shoah in Paris, there is an exposition, a very short, not a very big one, of les engagés. Les engagés it's mostly people who enrolled to the Legion, to the French foreigner Legion, and many of them were of communists during the war.
It's only because you were talking a lot of saving children, and I know that a lot of Jewish communists coming from Warsaw, from Poland, from the east, were sent to Belgium and France and so on, especially for this task, for saving, and they saved a lot of children, as far as I know.
Thank you all. Derek, you asked about how come we did not have in this a conference a paper of United States Jewish soldiers, numbering some 550,000. That's the highest number. Well, we sent a call for papers and there was no answer, but you gave actually the answer, or you dedicated a lot or a large part of your excellent lecture to this, and I feel we covered it. Another point is, you mentioned quite rightly, and I think others feel as well, that the issue of this 1,600,000 soldiers in the Allied armies during World War II is hardly known here. And during the preparations to the conference, anyone you met and spoke with said, half a million? More than half a million? We had quite a media coverage on the nets, the Ynet, and on the radio, and they were all stunned to find the numbers, and all asked how come this is not known. And I think you also gave answers regarding
partially because of the time.
Yeah, because fighting and bravery should be associated to Zionism and not to the Nebuchadnezzar Jews in exile. Yesterday, but I think it is starting to be corrected. Yesterday we met the lady who is in charge of the history studies in high schools, and we asked her, well, how about correcting it? She said it's already been corrected and it's already in the curriculum, so we hope for. I think in recent years this Zionist hoo-ha is a bit less expressed.
I think
One
that
more point,
we are going one step ahead, because tomorrow we are going to tell about how we are going to establish this issue in Israel. But actually, the whole answer of that lady, Ona, is quite complicated, because her answer is during one question in the matrix. This is the answer of the Minister of Education. And this question came 5 years ago when the veterans, the head of the organization of the veterans, came to the Minister of Education and asked him the same question that you asked him just now. And he said, I'm going to put it to the matrix. Few months ago, she came to my office, put me the matrix form and said, you see, we promised, this is the question. And I said, with all my respect, when you asked me a question about Hebrew, you taught me about 12 years before. English, more or less the same. Mathematics, more or less the same. How many years do you teach me before or to prepare me to this question? She said 2 hours. I said, what? She said, weekly, monthly. She said, no, from the 6th grade to the 12th grade. This is what we gave. And our hope that maybe within the time, those 2 hours will be in the museum that tomorrow we are going to tell you about.
This is a conversation. I don't want to take away from people's breaks. It's past 11:30. I don't know what the custom is in Israel, but in the United Kingdom, if people don't get their tea, they get very cross.
No, we don't get
I leave it up to you. You can call the session then when it's after 11:30, so it's not in my hands anymore.
Just one more point regarding the two lovely French ladies. In enhancing or the importance of Jews in the French resistance is reflected in the fact that when the Haganah established its office in Paris after the war, in order to organize the survivors and protect them and one of the main issues that you find in the document, and you find a lot of files, is how is the Haganah going to control the chutzpah armée juive, who is still, 1946, 1947, is still there.
With all the assets, with
Polonsky,
all the assets.
Can I add something? I know I cannot compete the French ladies, but the Slovenian men, I would try to answer the question why this is not known in Israel. I think because it's not known in other countries. It's not known in former Yugoslavia, in Austria, in Germany, in France. This is not part of the national histories, what was going on, speaking of Jewish resistance. So it's not a surprise, for me at least, that people here don't know how many people were fighting. Now, the question you asked, I think it's very interesting, because I never asked myself this, but it's very important. At least in Yugoslavia, the Jews communists were quite important. If you ever heard of Moshe Pijada. Moshe Pijada was a painter, a very close friend of Josip Broz Tito. They actually became close while they were in prison before the war, and he was with him during the whole war, almost, and became an influential figure in Yugoslavia after the war, and you still have some streets named after him, even after '92. Even after this revisionist push that happened, not in all republics. Now, coming to the question, Jews, communists, we could see who was a communist when we see the structure, commanding structure in the units. If a person was Jew, he would most probably be so-called commissioners, because these partisan units have two commands. One was the political, and the other was the yeah, so if the Jewish person was a commissioner, he for sure was a communist before the war. And most of Jewish communists would be, I'm not sure, but I can't presume, in Belgrade, because Belgrade was more left-oriented there. I mean, now speaking about Jewish population there, than in Zagreb, for example. In Zagreb, Jews were middle class, and in Belgrade you could find them and most of them who were not somehow who could not flee, they were killed in Samište in this concentration camp near Sava River in Belgrade.